Hello, students. It's me again. We're getting ready to have some conversation and do our video lecture for the seventh in the series of classes for individuals and families. And we're going to spend some time in chapter 13 of the readings, planning and implementing change-oriented strategies. So a very important chapter as we look at our work with individuals and families, because it really gives you the context for thinking about how you want to intervene or how you plan to intervene with the families or individuals that you're working with. And so this chapter really takes a look at some of the major methodologies that we utilize in social work practice. And it's up to us to really think about what makes the most sense for ourselves, for the agencies that we work with, and more so for the clients that we are employed to serve. So, without any further ado, let's jump into our lecture and have some conversation about planning and implementing oriented strategies for change. As you can see from your readings, we're talking about change-oriented approaches. And so we're going to spend the time in this lecture series talking about these particular 5 approaches or methodologies to looking at our work with client and client families. So when we think about change-oriented approaches, we need to take a look at some of the things that are listed here in terms of what causes us to move in a general direction as we do some work with the families and the people that are involved with us. Looking at that ever important person and environment focus. So is the methodology that you were thinking about using taking into account this ecological theory? Does the problem-solving model provide enough structure and guidelines for the work with your clients? These are things that you need to think about as you are approaching the client families and the work that you will need to do with them. Is there an emphasis on establishing positive helping relationships, empowerment? Is it a multi-level assessment? Does it pay attention to the importance of diversity or have an acknowledgement of their oppression for a great number of client families that we serve? And so when you're thinking about the approach to use, really think about it through this particular lens in terms of the things that are listed here. We also need to be planning for those goal attainment strategies. So asking ourselves these questions as we think about it as well. And you can see the 4th bullet talks quite a bit about empirical conceptual evidence to support the effectiveness of this approach. So again, as we as a profession have moved more and more towards the evidence-based practice model, it's really around looking at the literature and looking at the research to actually make a determination about whether a particular methodology will work better with this particular type of a client family as opposed to others. So these are the attainment strategies that you need to keep in mind as you're looking at moving forward for working with the families and individuals that you will be working with. The first approach we're going to spend a little time talking about is a task-centered system. So when we think about task-centered, we're going to cover these particular tenets of task-centered. What does it mean, or what kind of things does the task-centered approach look like? The theoretical framework, application with diverse groups of minors, and just the evidence, the empirical evidence about what using this particular model may look like. So when we think about procedures for this task-centered model, it's around really looking at developing tasks. So, you're called to a family, you're working with them, there are problem issues that have been identified, and so the task-centered model really looks at developing a general set of tasks that will need to be accomplished through the time that you're working with this family. And there are tasks for families, there are tasks for social workers, and there are tasks that also look at behaviors as well as cognitive tasks. So we want people to maybe think about things in a little bit of a different light in terms of the work that we're doing. So as we think about these tasks that we develop based on the issues that have been presented along with our clients, it's about how do we enhance the client's commitment to carry out those tasks. So this particular methodology utilizes rewards and incentives. So if we are looking at, for example, let's say there is a problem issue that's been brought to this family and it involves a minor child who is not getting to school, or when he's at school he's not being very successful in the things that he needs to do. So the task might look like making sure that the child gets to school, so the adults have the responsibility of making sure that they arrive, and then the child having the responsibility to perform or behave a certain way while they're in a school setting. And we might think about what might a reward be for that minor for getting through a week with an absence of a certain type of behavior. So when we think about task-centered, again, it's about looking at those particular tasks that we're wanting folks to be involved in. So plan the details to carrying out that task. So what is that going to look like for you in that day? So what are you going to do to be okay at school? Analyzing and resolving obstacles. So you'll get feedback from the kid, for example, about what might be a barrier for him at school to perform the way that they need to, and then start to look at whether we're ready to assess those tasks. We might even set up a dynamic where we role play, or we do some rehearsing or modeling at home about how a child might want to perform at school. And so then we'll be summarizing that task plan. So that's a short example of how that might look. And then let's say the next thing, we have this wonderful plan that's set up, and for whatever reason it's not working. So the tasks that we have laid out for the child has failed miserably and consistently. So we need to look at performance problems that are related to that particular task. So was there a commitment from the young one about what they would need to do different? Are there adequate supports in terms of the plan that we had in place? Are there adverse beliefs? Is there a set of beliefs that really are contrary to how we want that child to act? Inadequate preparation. Did we jump in too soon? Did the social worker overreact? And the occurrence of the crisis. Was there a crisis that drove this thing to cause us to fail? Or was there something else behind that? So these are things that we need to think about too as we are utilizing the task-centered methodology. Failure to complete those tasks that we just talked about, looking at these areas in terms of targeting the problems, and then monitoring and evaluating for progress. So making the adjustments that we need to based on these things, and then really paying attention to the strengths and limitation and evaluating the process. So again, just a quick overview of what we're looking at when we're looking at a task-centered approach. Again, it's a target, problem identified and prioritized. We're looking at developing a goal, some general tasks, some specific tasks, and then we're going to look at monitoring what those outcomes are. And task-centered systems tend to be fairly short in duration, so it's a shorter time frame. It may be a number of months or maybe a month or two that we may be spending some time working with this family in an attempt to make sure that the behaviors are going to be mitigated. And when we look at this implementation sequence, it's these things that we need to pay attention to again as we look at the task and the ability for our clients to actually follow through and carry those out. Again, as task happens or do not happen for us in terms of what the expectations are, it's really relating to understanding the specificity of the task and then looking at things that are related to the target problem. So really digging into these particular areas as you do your work with those individuals and families to try to get a sense of why tasks were not completed. monitoring the progress, again, documenting what's been completed, looking at the conditions, the actions, the behaviors, the consistency, the frequency at which the tasks are actually met. Then looking at any potential barriers and obstacles that might be causing us not to reach the degree of success that we'd like. And then, if need be, renegotiating those particular tasks. We might want to do something different with that particular kid who's not making it in his school because of behavioral things. We may want to look at whether the approach that we utilize in terms of the tasks that were set, are they going to be the right ones, or do we need to look at making some adjustment based on the level of progress that we're actually having. So when we think about the strengths and the limitations, we've got tons of research. We see the populations or some of the issues that it's fairly effective with in terms of family problems, emotional distress, mental health, drug abuse, things of those particular issues, transition stuff. And it's also shows some efficacy with diverse populations, so it works in a multiple, maybe in a culturally sensitive way in terms of looking at being able to address the needs of the different families that access those types of services. And then it also honors self-determination, strength, and empowerment. So it's really built where those tasks are really designed on what families are able to actually do and to come up and to create and to even brainstorm about. Some of the limitations are that it's not clear that it's effective with involuntary clients, and we talked a little bit earlier about what constitutes an involuntary client. These are folks who are engaged in services under duress or under the threat of court action. So folks are really not seeking out your services, really don't think that maybe they're necessary, but have to participate anyway. So we're saying that there may be some limitations in terms of its effectiveness with this particular population. And then the time limits. Sometimes we've got these task-centered approach, which are very specific in terms of the amount of time and resources that they can spend with a particular family and moving on. So sometimes we may have situations that may need to result in a longer period of intervention, in which this model doesn't necessarily lend itself to. As we move forward, we're looking at the next model, which is really crisis intervention. So we have some sense of what happens when we got a crisis. And so when we think about crisis intervention, we think about that key word, crisis. And so typically in a crisis situation, you've got some things that have occurred. And so from the readings, a crisis is described as an event or a situation that upsets a person or family's normal psychic balance. So there's this thing that comes up. So a crisis could be a tornado that destroys the family home, a hurricane, things of that particular nature. So when we think about crisis, we need to think about that it's just that. We've got an event or a series of events that have, for lack of a better word, really mitigated the family's ability to function as normally as they have in the past. And so thinking about those things, and then thinking about that crisis stage and really looking at where people are. So often in intervention with these families, your stage one is people are in shock and denial. And if you look at news reports, or if you look at disasters that have happened across the country, and they interview the clients or those client families, you can see clear evidence of the shock and denial in often cases. School shootings are another one where we see those kind of crisis pieces. And so stage two, we're looking at the unusual problem-solving skills to reduce the tension, increasing the tension, feelings of overwhelmness and depression. Those are some of the stages that you'll be looking at that families might be going through. So we're looking at duration of contact, how we're going to intervene with minors, what are some of the benefits of the crisis, the theoretical framework, as well as the application with diverse groups. And so when we think about this procedure or the process, this is what we would be looking at or expected to utilize when we're using this crisis intervention model. So we'd be walking through with the family these particular 6 steps. We'd also be looking at strengths and limitations of this whole crisis intervention piece. So again, looking through the eyes along with the family about these particular areas when we're faced with a crisis and we're doing work with them. So we're listening, we're helping define the problem, we're ensuring that clients are safe, we're providing adequate support, and then we are moving into the acting piece in terms of looking at examining the alternatives. What are some other things we can do? What kind of plans can we make as a result of this crisis? And then how can we obtain some commitment? So is everybody on board, and are we ready to really move forward with what we need to do? So again, the crisis worker's actions are on that particular continuum in terms of looking at what and how they're needing to respond. So as you can see, when folks are in more of the listening, assessing piece, it's fairly non-directive. The assessing is much more collaborative. And then some of the acting stuff, the crisis worker may even be more directive, as well as there's different levels of mobility that are expected as well when we think about that. So cognitive restructuring is yet another therapeutic process that really looks at incorporating various cognitive behavioral approaches. Cognitive behavioral therapy, RET, rational emotive therapy, cognitive therapy of depression are some of the better known methodologies in terms of working with this particular type of technique. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of those tenets. We're going to do a little bit of exploration around cognitive distortions. The evidence, again, looking at how it works with diverse groups, as well as procedures for cognitive restructuring. So when we think about cognitive, we're thinking about cognition. We're thinking about things that originate in the mind. So it's primarily dealing with our thought or our thinking process. And so when we're looking at restructuring, restructuring is just that. It's about how we're restructuring thoughts or helping people look at how they structure their thoughts as they have proven to be problematic in terms of an individual's or family's ability to actually even function. So when we think about it, we're looking at the areas in blue in terms of these particular ways that we would intervene. Looking at self-statements, looking at identifying situations that engender this dysfunctional cognition, looking at rewarding folks for when they're able to kind of recognize what we've set up for them and follow through with that, looking at self-statements, beliefs, patterns of thoughts that underlie the problem. And so when we think about cognitive distortions, for example, we're talking about things like this. And so a cognitive distortion, an example of a cognitive distortion might be thinking that is all or nothing. So it's either all done or it's just a disaster, where we continually blame. So it's always something else or some other situation or some other person that causes things to happen the way they do. Catastrophizing, which means that you're just really looking at the negative and awfulizing every situation that you find yourself coming into. Discounting positives, jumping to conclusions, reading minds, overgeneralizing situations. Those are all examples of cognitive distortions, and you can see that if those particular distortions go on unchecked, it could really hamper a person's ability or family's ability to function in a much more normal way. So it's about learning how to cope with those things. So again, when we think about this slide, it talks about the beliefs that people have, the beliefs that we all have, this mental act of placing faith, confidence, trust in a person, place, thing, or situation that we just know to be how we see the world, and then those self-expectations. What are they actually saying when we look at those things? So this is a way to really look at this whole understanding of why people are looking at things the way that they do. And then the other pieces might be to look at being able to identify those things. And so using a log that might actually help people look at rating their feelings, look at the belief statements, and just really start to pick apart some of the things that are happening in their head to make some determination about how they're driving the process and what you can do differently. Solution focus talks also about looking at solutions. So it's similar to task-centered in terms of the time frames, and we're going to talk about these particular aspects of solution-focused treatment or therapy. So again, it's about, let me go back here for just a moment. When we're thinking about solution-focused therapy, again, it's similar to task, but it's brief solution-focused. So the time that you're spending with families will be fairly short. It might be a month or less depending on the agency and the work that they're doing. And so as we think about the solutions and procedures and techniques, it's about defining the problem, identifying goals, exploring the exceptions, and then ending the session feedback and evaluating progress. So a solution-focused treatment intervention might look very different and move at a much more rapid pace, and that all of these particular procedures might even happen the first visit that you're actually out making with your family in terms of looking at those things and then putting a plan of action into place to set up a way to monitor that feedback. So we're moving also on into case management. And so many public, many nonprofit, many federal agencies that do social service delivery of any kind typically use a case management model. So as I think about my own history in social work, I spent a number of years, as many of you know, with Ramsey County and was the actual social worker as well as a manager in a case management unit that did nothing but do the managing of cases for the families that we were involved with. And so when we think about case management, we're really looking at these particular functions. So we're doing that outreach piece, you're doing the intake and assessment and screening, you're doing multidimensional assessments, and then you're setting goals. And so this is a model, for example, that has worked really well in child protection because all of these things are part of us working with the family to create a reasonably safe environment for children to live and to grow in. And so these are some of the steps that we would work through in terms of the case management functions. We would also do planning, and we would also look at resources. And so I spent a bulk of my time looking at connecting parents to resources. So there may be chemical dependency treatment, there might be mental health treatment or therapy or family therapy that I might look at having families partake in. There might be parenting classes. There may be issues around how to maintain home and independent living skills. These are some of the case management tools that we would use to look at addressing some of the needs that families raised. Monitoring the progress, obviously, reassessing those fixed intervals when we need to, and then really looking at the outcome. So after all is said and done and all the services have been provided, is there a substantial outcome in terms of behavior that warrants some degree of success for the families that we actually work with? So this actually concludes the video lecture as it relates to Chapter 13 in terms of planning and implementing change-oriented strategies. So as always, I encourage you to continue to read your assigned lessons for today and come to class prepared to have some discussion about the topics. Thank you, and we'll see you in class.